My name is Danielle Ross, and the night of my graduation party began with a whisper that cut deeper than any blade. Smile, Leech. Those two words hissed from my mother's painted lips, slipped into my ear like poison before a single toast had been raised. I was 24 walking into the grand ballroom of the Hilton in downtown Seattle, a place designed for celebration champagne, bubbling chandeliers blazing, and guests dressed in silk and satin. Yet for me, it felt like a stage set for humiliation. I remember how the marble floor reflected the golden light, how every table shimmered beneath crisp linens and crystal glasses. Strangers greeted my parents as if they were royalty, my father with his politician's handshake, my mother with her effortless smile. To the outside world, the Ross family was immaculate, enviable. Inside, I knew better. I had grown up in a house where cruelty hid behind crystal vases and polished silverware, where affection was rationed and recognition always carried someone else's name. Tonight, it seemed, would be no different. The master of ceremonies stepped up, his voice booming across the hall. Let us welcome the Ross family and their remarkable daughter, Clarissa. Thunderous applause followed. My sister Clarissa shone under the spotlight, every guest rising to their feet as if she had won a Nobel Prize. My father clapped the loudest, his grin stretching wider than I'd ever seen. My mother dabbed the corner of her eye as though she were proud enough to weep. And here is their youngest daughter, fresh from completing her degree, the MC added almost as an afterthought. No name, no spotlight, just a smattering of polite claps, fading almost before they began. I stood there, heat crawling up my neck, my jaw tightening as if bracing against a storm. In that moment, I realized they weren't just ignoring me, they were erasing me in front of hundreds of eyes. During the family photo that followed, my mother leaned in her perfume, wrapping around me like a suffocating scarf. Smile, Leech, she murmured again, the corners of her lips never faltering. I knew what she wanted for me to snap, to explode, to create a spectacle that would only confirm their narrative that Danielle was ungrateful, dramatic, unstable. But I refused. Not tonight. Not on their terms. You see, this wasn't the first time they had sharpened their knives with a smile. Growing up, humiliation was served at the dinner table as casually as bread rolls. At 14, when I won the state science fair, the local paper ran a feature story. But the photo they used wasn't of me. It was Clarissa, her arm draped over my shoulder, the caption reading, Clarissa Ross, Mentors, Young Competitor. I was reduced to a side note in my own victory. When I dared to protest, my father's words echoed like a verdict, no one likes a sore winner. Learn to share the spotlight. At 16, I trained for months for a half marathon. I crossed the finish line in the top 10 lungs, burning legs, shaking but triumphant. Clarissa signed up at the last minute, quit halfway through, and yet at every family dinner afterward, my mother praised her bravery for even attempting. My achievement once again vanished beneath her shadow. Even in social gatherings, they played their little games, seating me behind a pillar at weddings near the kitchen doors, at banquets, my father chuckling. Better view of the buffet. Out of sight, out of mind. That had always been their rule for me. And now, as I stood in that glittering ballroom, I realized tonight was not an accident. This was orchestration. From the missing introduction to the cutting whispers, they were scripting my humiliation. But what they didn't know, what no one yet realized, was that I had stopped reacting. I had stopped playing their part in this twisted play. Instead, I started watching, cataloging every slight, every stolen moment. Tonight, I wasn't just a scapegoat, I was a witness. And witnesses, when the time comes, can burn the script to ash. I scanned the room. My sister, laughing with a magazine editor, my parents basking in their glow, guests clinking glasses without noticing the fissures beneath the surface. And I thought, if this is how they begin the night, how far will they go by the end? That was the hook of it all, not just for me, but for anyone listening now. Because sometimes the people you should trust most are the ones holding the sharpest knives. And sometimes survival isn't about fighting back right away. It's about waiting, watching, and knowing exactly when to strike. The applause that thundered for my sister still echoed in the ballroom when I found my seat, or rather the seat they had chosen for me. It was shoved so close to the service doors that every time a server passed through, the swing brushed my chair. From there, I had a perfect view of the real head table, my parents seated proudly in the center. Clarissa glowing on their right, basking in every compliment tossed her way. My name had already been diminished once tonight, but this seating arrangement made the hierarchy impossible to ignore. I watched as the editor from a local lifestyle magazine leaned closer to my sister, a glossy issue open between them. That was when my stomach tightened. Spread across those pages was my environmental engineering project, months of fieldwork design and sleepless nights. But the name beneath the headline wasn't mine. It was hers. Clarissa Ross, the prodigy. A slow heat crawled into my chest, my hands curling into fists under the table. Before I could even find the words, one of my father's friends clapped me on the shoulder. "Your sister's work is impressive. Didn't know she was into environmental science." My smile was thin, my voice even thinner. "She's very good at presentation." It wasn't it, presentation. Performance. My family had always prized appearances above truth. In their world, I existed only to feed Clarissa's narrative, to be erased, repackaged, and handed back to the world with her name stamped across it. But I had learned something over the years. When they tried to humiliate me, reacting too quickly only fueled their story. The ungrateful daughter, the angry sister, the troublemaker. No, not tonight. Tonight I would not flinch. Tonight I would wait. And while I waited, I started seeing the pattern unfold. At the dessert table, my mother's laugh rose above the chatter, her timing deliberate. "Remember when Danielle almost got expelled, weeks of skipping mandatory seminars?" A ripple of polite laughter circled the table. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I set it down gently, forcing calm into my voice. Actually, I said, eyes fixed on the guests, I was on an academic exchange in Europe, sponsored by my department chair. The words landed like stones in still water ripples, stretching wider with every passing second. For just a moment I caught it, the twitch at the corner of my mother's smile, the crack in her armor. She turned away too quickly, pretending she hadn't heard. But I had marked the first fissure. Not long after, Hollis appeared at my side. Hollis, the quiet classmate who had always been more of an observer than a participant, with a camera strap slung across their shoulder like a badge. They leaned in, voice low. "You've heard about the invitations, right?" I frowned. "What about them?" "They printed your start time 30 minutes later. Just yours. People thought they were early. By the time they showed up, the photos were already done. Makes it look like you were late." The revelation slid into place like a puzzle piece I hadn't wanted to find. The incomplete introduction, the missing spotlight, now the invitations. None of this was accidental. It was a sequence. A carefully choreographed performance designed to cast me as the fool. And then, like a tide turning, my Aunt Renata slipped something into my hand. A sealed envelope, no words, just a steady look, her eyes saying later. Later came on the balcony, the night air cool against my skin, my pulse finally slowing as I tore the envelope open. Inside, photocopies of my scholarship awards, grant letters, receipts stamped with my name and student ID. Proof. Real, undeniable proof. A note scrawled across the top in my aunt's neat handwriting, for when they pushed too far. I tucked the papers deep into my clutch, the weight of them grounding me. My parents thought I had nothing but stubbornness. What they didn't know was that I had ammunition. Back inside, I wore my mask as smoothly as they wore theirs. I smiled at the right moments, nodded in rhythm with the music, let them believe they were still in control. But under the surface, the ground had shifted. They no longer had the monopoly on the story. And here's something I've learned the hard way. The higher someone climbs on their false pedestal, the harder they fall when truth finally hits. Tonight, I wasn't just the girl they called a leech. I was the girl with proof in her clutch and witnesses at her side. Before we move on, let me pause, because I know some of you watching have been here too. Maybe not in this exact ballroom, but in your own family, your own circle where recognition was stolen and your light was dimmed. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment where someone erased your work, your voice, your worth? I want to hear your story. Because silence is how they win, and tonight, I was done being silent. I sometimes think back to when I first understood what it meant to be invisible in my own family. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow erosion, years of small cuts that together carved me into someone they could pretend not to see. When I was 14, my science project, a water purification prototype I had built from scratch, won first place at the state level. The local paper ran a feature on the winners, and for a fleeting moment, I thought my family would finally be proud of me. But the photo in print told a different story. Clarissa stood smiling in the foreground, her arm draped over my shoulder, the caption reading, "Clarissa Ross mentors young competitor." I wasn't the star. I wasn't even the subject. I was an accessory in my own success. When I protested, my father's verdict was swift. No one likes a sore winner. Learn to share the spotlight. That's what it was always about, sharing. Sharing the spotlight, sharing the praise, sharing the oxygen until there was nothing left that was mine. At 16, I trained through rain, through shin splints, through exhaustion for the half marathon. When I crossed the finish line in the top 10, I felt unstoppable. But at dinner that night, the story wasn't about my finish. It was about how Clarissa had bravely attempted the race, signing up last minute and dropping out halfway. My mother gushed about her courage while my top 10 placement faded into silence. I learned then that achievement was fragile in my family. It could be lifted from me as easily as setting down a glass of water claimed by someone else, rewritten in the narrative, where Clarissa always shined, and Danielle was always an afterthought. And the seating games, that was their favorite sport. At weddings, I was placed behind columns. At reunions, near the bathroom doors. At banquets shoved so close to the kitchen I could smell the dishwater. My father would chuckle, "Better view of the buffet." The joke never changed, and neither did the sting. Out of sight, out of mind, that was their rule for me. So when I walked into that ballroom on graduation night and saw my name brushed aside my chair, tucked into the shadows, it wasn't new. It was a ritual, perfected over decades. What was new was me. I had changed. You see, humiliation has a way of shaping you. At first it bends you, makes you smaller, convinces you that maybe you deserve it. But if you survive long enough, if you let those scars turn to armor, it also gives you something else: patience. A cold, sharp patience that waits and watches and remembers. That night I felt the patience hardening inside me like steel. Every stolen credit, every erased moment, every backhanded comment, they weren't just memories anymore. They were ammunition. I watched Clarissa laugh at the head table, her hand fluttering as the editor praised her project. I watched my parents beam like their lives were perfectly scripted. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt steady. Because while they were busy playing their games, I was collecting evidence. That was the difference between us. They thrived on spectacle, but I was learning to thrive on silence. Still, silence can be heavy, can it? I know some of you watching have felt that same weight, the frustration of biting your tongue, of swallowing your protest, because you know they'll twist it against you. Let me say this directly. If you've ever been made invisible in your own family, you are not alone. Drop a comment if you know that pain, because your voice matters here, even if it didn't matter to them. Invisibility is not the same as insignificance. That's what they never understood. They thought by pushing me behind pillars and near kitchen doors, by stealing my name from articles and headlines, they could erase me. But what they really did was give me a view. They didn't expect a view from the margins where you can see the whole game play out. And from that margin, I realized something important. Tonight wasn't just another round of humiliation. It was a crescendo, a culmination of every little cut they'd ever dealt me. They thought they were staging my downfall, but what they were really doing was building the perfect stage for theirs. As the music swelled and laughter floated through the air, I sat with my back to the kitchen doors, my clutch heavy with proof from Aunt Renata. My patience wasn't passive anymore. It was active, sharp, and waiting. And in that moment, I whispered to myself the truth they could never erase. I belong here, and tonight the world will finally see it. The laughter from the head table carried like a chorus, polished and bright, but to me, it sounded like nails dragging across glass. Clarissa, draped in a gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, leaned closer to the editor as he turned another glossy page. My heart stopped. There, printed across 2 full spreads, was my project, my research, my sweat, my months of muddy boots and sleepless nights measuring water tables in the Cascades, my design, my diagrams, my words. Only the name printed beneath the headline wasn't mine. It was hers. The air in my chest burned. I stared at the page until it blurred, until the letters seemed to drip into one another. But before I could rise, before I could expose the theft right there in front of everyone, a heavy hand landed on my shoulder. "Your sister's work is impressive," one of my father's business friends said with a broad grin. Didn't know she was into environmental science. I forced a smile so tight it hurt. She's very good at presentation. That word presentation seemed to echo through me. That was all they cared about. Not the data, not the sweat, not the lonely nights hunched over blueprints in my apartment. Just the presentation, the illusion. Clarissa had mastered it. My parents had funded it. And I was always the raw material stripped for parts recycled into her storyline. But here's the thing about raw material, it can also build weapons. I bit back the words clawing up my throat. Because if there's one thing my family had taught me, it was that reacting too soon played into their hands. They wanted me angry, they wanted me loud, they wanted to point to me and say, "See, unstable, ungrateful, vindictive." So instead, I stayed still. My fork scraped gently against the plate, my face unreadable. Let them think they'd won this round. Let them climb higher on their false pedestal. Because the higher they climbed, the harder they'd fall. The truth had a funny way of surfacing, and that night I already had two allies, Hollis quiet and watchful with their camera always at the ready, and Aunt Renata whose envelope sat heavy in my clutch like a secret heartbeat. As the evening stretched on, the insults came dressed as jokes. My mother's perfectly timed anecdotes reminding guests of my failures, my father's asides about how much Clarissa had mentored me. Even the seating arrangement placing me where no one could hear me without turning their head was a performance. But when I glanced back at that magazine at Clarissa's name printed where mine should have been, something inside me hardened. I wasn't going to be erased tonight, not again. I watched her laugh at the table, a laugh a little too sharp, a little too practiced. I watched my father beam his hand heavy on her shoulder, like a king crowning his heir. And I thought about every time they'd stolen from me the science fair, the marathon, the countless small victories rewritten to star someone else. This wasn't just plagiarism. It was identity theft soul deep. And this time it wasn't going to pass without consequence. Now I want to pause here and say this, some of you know exactly how this feels. Maybe not in a ballroom, maybe not on glossy magazine pages, but in your own lives, at work, at home, in friendships where someone took credit for what you bled for. If that's you, I want you to share it in the comments. Because your story deserves a name, your name. That's why I didn't rise then, why I didn't shout. I wasn't going to give them another story to twist. Instead, I was going to wait until the truth could roar so loud, no one could pretend not to hear it. So I sat silent and still, but inside the resolve spread through me like wildfire. My project was mine. My future was mine. And tonight, no matter how they dressed it, the Ross family's pageantry was going to collapse under the weight of their own lies. Because in the end, presentation can only carry you so far. Reality always demands its turn. The clinking of silverware and the hum of polite chatter filled the ballroom, but I could hear my mother's voice slice right through it, aimed perfectly so everyone could catch the punchline. "Remember when Danielle almost got expelled?" she said, laughter dancing at the edge of her words. "Weeks of skipping mandatory seminars. We were so worried she'd never recover." A ripple of laughter spread through the table like a wave. Some guests chuckled politely, others raised their eyebrows as though they'd just discovered something scandalous. And there it was again, the ritual. My mother spinning the truth into ridicule, tossing my name into the air like confetti, just so it could flutter to the ground. But this time I didn't choke on my silence. I set my fork down carefully, the sound sharp against the porcelain, and said evenly, "Actually, I was in Europe. Academic exchange, sponsored by my department chair." The words weren't loud, they weren't dramatic, but they landed. I saw it, the flicker at the edge of her smile, the quick glance away, the almost imperceptible crack. The guests' chuckles faltered into an awkward hush. For the first time that evening, it wasn't me on the defensive. It was her. I leaned back in my chair, my face calm, but inside I was cataloging everything. Each insult, each joke, each scheme. Because it wasn't just a night of humiliation anymore. It was a carefully laid plan, piece by piece, designed to make me stumble. And then Hollis slipped into the seat beside me. Camera strap across their shoulder, eyes sharp beneath the fringe of their hair. "You've heard about the invitations, right?" they murmured. I frowned. "What about them?" "They printed your start time 30 minutes later. Just yours. People thought they were early. By the time they arrived, the photos were already taken. Makes it look like you showed up late." The blood drained from my face, not from surprise, but from recognition. Of course. The missing name in the introduction, the stolen credit, the poisoned anecdotes. It wasn't random. It was sequential, calculated. They were building a story where I was always the failure. And just as the realization settled, My Aunt Renata brushed past my chair. In her hand, a sealed envelope. She slipped it into my palm so swiftly no one noticed. Our eyes met briefly hers, steady, resolute, as if to say not tonight. You're not alone. Later on the balcony, I tore it open with trembling hands. Inside were photocopies of my scholarship awards, grant letters, receipts stamped with my name and student ID. Proof. Proof that the life they painted for me, a dependent, a leech, wasn't real. A note scrawled across the top read simply, "For when they push too far." I held the papers tight against my chest. I wasn't defenseless, not anymore. Back inside, the ballroom seemed to glow brighter, but I saw it differently now. The chandeliers didn't shine on them alone. The spotlight wasn't theirs to own. Because I had evidence. I had allies, and I had patience. I glanced at Clarissa, her laugh a little too high, her smile a little too brittle. My parents exchanged loaded looks, their eyes darting toward me as if gauging whether I suspected anything. They thought I was still playing my part. They thought I was still the silent shadow. But they didn't realize the ground had shifted. Now let me pause because I know many of you have been here too, maybe not with champagne flutes and chandeliers, but in your own families, your workplaces, your circles. Have you ever realized in one chilling moment that the game was rigged against you from the start? If so, tell me in the comments. I want to know how you saw the truth for what it was. Because that's what this moment was for me, clarity. And clarity is dangerous. For them, as I folded the papers back into my clutch, I made a silent promise. They could humiliate me, they could steal from me, they could rewrite my story, but not forever. Because tonight I wasn't the girl sitting by the kitchen doors anymore. Tonight I was the girl holding the match. And soon enough I was going to strike it. The envelope from Aunt Renata weighed heavy in my clutch like a secret heartbeat. Proof, real, undeniable proof that everything my parents had tried to erase could be restored with a single reveal. For years they had painted me as a burden, a dependent, a leech clinging to their generosity. But inside that envelope were my scholarships, my grant letters, my receipts. Evidence that I had built my own future with my own hands. I slipped back into the ballroom, my face composed, my steps measured. The chandeliers still burned bright, the music still floated soft and elegant, but to me the entire room felt different. I wasn't empty-handed anymore, and that changed everything. I took my seat again near the service doors, clutch resting in my lap. From across the room I could feel my parents' eyes on me. Every so often their smiles faltered, their gazes too quick, too sharp, before snapping back into the masks of gracious hosts. Clarissa's laugh rang out, but it was a beat too loud, a note too high. They were jittery, watching me the way hunters watch prey that refuses to play along. I didn't flinch. I didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they had rattled me. Instead, I raised my glass as though nothing had changed, nodding at guests as though I were perfectly at ease. But inside my pulse was steady, stronger than it had ever been. Because here's what I knew: power shifts the moment you hold the truth. My parents didn't know what Renata had given me. They didn't know Hollis was watching with a camera that caught everything. They thought the night was still theirs to script. But the script had already slipped from their hands. The band played something light and romantic, couples swaying near the edge of the dance floor. Waiters moved in careful rhythm, refilling glasses, setting plates, clearing crumbs. The air was thick with perfume, laughter, the clinking of crystal. Yet beneath it all there was a tension, an undercurrent I could almost taste. My parents kept glancing my way. Clarissa's posture grew stiffer, her hand tapping against the stem of her glass. It was as if they sensed I wasn't playing my role, that I had stopped being the easy scapegoat, and they were right. Because I had no intention of stumbling through their traps anymore. I was holding my ground, waiting for the right moment. And waiting, I realized, is its own form of defiance. It reminded me of every time they had pushed me aside, every time I'd been placed near the kitchen doors, behind the columns hidden from view. Back then, I thought being invisible meant being powerless. But now I saw it differently. Invisibility gave me a vantage point. From the margins, I could see everything, every glance, every whisper, every move. And tonight I wasn't going to waste that view. I sipped my champagne and let the music wash over me, my fingers brushing the edge of the envelope tucked safely inside my clutch. Proof. Ammunition. A promise to myself that when they finally pushed too far, I wouldn't just endure, I would strike back. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever had someone try to erase the truth of your life, to rewrite your story as though you were nothing more than a footnote in theirs if you have shared it in the comments, because silence protects them, but your voice, your story is what gives you back your power. Back in that ballroom, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: they thought they still held the upper hand. They thought I was cornered, boxed into a night of humiliation. But they couldn't see what I held. They couldn't see how the tide had already turned. And that knowledge kept me calm even as the night shifted into something darker. Because what I didn't realize yet was that humiliation wasn't their endgame anymore. They were reaching for something far more sinister. But I was ready. For the first time in my life, I was ready. The night had grown heavy, though no one inside the ballroom seemed to notice. Laughter spilled like champagne, the band played brighter melodies, and the servers moved in polished choreography. But I could feel it, the shift. A current of something darker thrummed beneath the glittering surface, and it pulled me toward the side corridor like an undertow. It was Hollis who drew my eyes there first. Across the room, they caught my gaze and tilted their head toward a half-closed service door. Nothing about it was casual. The moment our eyes locked, I knew follow. I slipped away from my table, my heels soundless on the carpet. The hallway was dim, lined with storage carts and crates of unopened wine. And then I heard it, my father's voice, low and deliberate, seeping through the gap in the service door. "Just make sure she drinks it." The air froze in my lungs. My mother's reply was quick, steady, like she'd rehearsed it. "No scene, no trouble. She'll just seem faint from the champagne." Then came a third voice, the event coordinator. "I'll cue the toast." I felt my pulse hammer so violently I thought the walls might echo it. Through the narrow slit I could see the shapes of their silhouettes, the practiced calm in their voices. They weren't just plotting humiliation, they were planning elimination. Hollis's phone was already in their hand recording. Their expression didn't waver, though their knuckles whitened around the device. "Clear as day," they whispered when I glanced at them, my face pale. I stepped back from the door as though it might burn me. My body was trembling, but my mind was sharp-focused. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was survival. The truth hit me with such force that for a moment I swayed on my feet. My parents wanted me gone. Literally gone. The years of ridicule, the stolen credit, the endless cuts had all been leading here. Tonight they weren't satisfied with erasing my name. They wanted to erase me. I looked at Hollis, their phone still capturing the muffled voices from inside. "You have them," I whispered, though my lips barely moved. They nodded. "But don't move too soon. If you do, they'll spin it. They always spin it." That was the danger, wasn't it? They were masters of performance. If I confronted them outright, they would smile, laugh, insist it was all a misunderstanding. Guests would rush to defend them. The poor, misunderstood parents, the daughter overreacting again. No, the time hadn't come yet. The blade was still hidden in their sleeve. My task was to make sure they revealed it in the open, in the light where no one could look away. I drew a long breath, steadying my nerves. My hand tightened around the clutch at my side, the weight of Aunt Renata's documents grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't defenseless. Between her proof and Hollis's recording, I had a fortress. But knowing the plan and standing in its shadow were two different things. As I slipped back into the ballroom, the chandeliers seemed harsher, every reflection off the glass, like a spotlight burning into my skin. The servers were circulating with trays of champagne flutes, each one a potential weapon now. My parents weren't mingling anymore. They weren't laughing or basking. They were watching me, waiting. I forced a smile, careful and controlled. To anyone watching, I looked calm, but inside every nerve in my body screamed. And I know some of you watching right now have felt that too, that moment when you realize the danger isn't abstract, it's real. It's breathing down your neck. Tell me, have you ever had a moment when the people you trusted most revealed themselves as threats? Share it below, because your story might be the light someone else needs. That was what kept me steady, the knowledge that I wasn't powerless anymore. For the first time I had evidence, allies, and clarity I realized is the most dangerous weapon of all. Because the second you see the truth, you can never unsee it. And once I had, there was no going back. Tonight, the Ross family thought they were writing the final chapter of my story. But really, they were setting the stage for their own. Back in the ballroom, the celebration pulsed forward, as if nothing in the world had shifted. Servers floated between tables, placing fresh champagne flutes with practiced grace. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, their golden light spilling across gowns and tuxedos. To the guests, it was another glittering night. To me, it was a minefield. I slid into my seat, my clutch pressed against my side, my face a mask of composure. But my eyes stayed sharp, scanning the room for every move, every flicker. And then I saw it. Grady Ross. My father drifted toward my table with the swagger of a politician. His smile polished his hand resting too casually at his side. He leaned down, his voice warm enough for those nearby to hear. "Making sure you're all set." I nodded, forcing a pleasant smile, but my gaze never left his hands. And there it was, the flick of his fingers, subtle but undeniable. Something slipped from his palm into my glass, the faintest fizz, then gone. It happened in less than a breath, a tiny gesture no one else would notice, but I saw it, and worse, I knew it. Every instinct screamed at me to recoil, to knock the glass away, to shout. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Hollis's warning echoed in my mind. If you move too soon, they'll spin it. So I stayed still. My pulse thundered, but my hand moved slowly, gracefully, lifting the glass as if nothing at all had happened. I rose from my seat, my heels tapping lightly against the polished floor, and walked toward the head table. Clarissa was in mid-laughter, her head tilted back, basking in the glow of her audience. Her friends leaned in, waiting for the next quip. She didn't even notice when I stopped beside her. "Oh," I said lightly, holding up my flute, "I think you've got my glass. Yours is probably warmer." Her smirk was instantaneous, her voice dripping with superiority. "You're picky tonight." I returned her smile, one that never reached my eyes. "You know me." And just like that, she swapped glasses with me. No hesitation, no suspicion. Around us, a few chuckled, harmless sibling banter, they thought. If only they knew. I returned to my seat, the now safe glass in my hand. My smile stayed fixed, but my eyes cut briefly to the side where Hollis stood. Their phone angled just enough for me to glimpse the recording, my father's hand, the flick, the fizz. Clear, undeniable. Then came the voice of the event coordinator, smooth and amplified through the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's raise a toast to the graduate." Every guest lifted their glass. Across the room, Clarissa sipped deeply, her throat tilting back, her laughter resuming. My father's jaw clenched. My mother's smile froze, her eyes darting to me for a split second too long. And I knew they knew. I held my glass aloft, lips brushing the rim, but I didn't drink. I didn't need to. Because the real stage had been set and the actors had taken their cues. Now let me pause here, because I know some of you have lived through moments where survival hinged on a single decision, where you played along while the danger unfolded right in front of you. Have you ever had to act calm while everything inside you screamed, "Share it below"? Because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. That's what this was, strategy, waiting for their trap to spring back on them. The room glittered, glasses clinked, laughter rose. To the crowd, nothing was amiss. But I sat with my glass untouched, watching the stage they had built collapse in slow motion. Because poison only needs one sip, and this time it wasn't me who took it. The toast had barely ended when the shift began. At first, it was subtle. Clarissa's laugh catching in her throat, her smile faltering as she pressed her hand to her chest. Guests leaned closer, assuming maybe the champagne had gone down wrong. But then her knees buckled. A fork clattered onto marble as she reached for the table to steady herself. Gasps rippled across the ballroom like shattered glass. My parents were at her side instantly, the perfect picture of parental concern. My father's arm braced her, my mother's voice pitched high with panic as she dabbed a napkin at her lips. But I saw it just for a second, the raw flash of fear in their eyes. Not fear for her, fear of me, fear that I knew. Around us, guests murmured, shifting uneasily in their chairs. Phones appeared in hands. The ballroom's glow turned to chaos in the span of heartbeats. And while everyone scrambled to understand what had just unfolded, Hollis slipped to my side, their phone angled discreetly toward me. On the screen, I saw it again, my father's hand hovering above my glass, the tiny flick of his fingers, the fizz. The evidence. Undeniable. I could have ended it right there. I could have leapt to my feet, held up the recording, and shouted the truth. But I didn't. Because justice delivered too soon can still be stolen, twisted into another performance. They were masters of spin, and I wasn't going to give them that chance. No, the stage wasn't quite set yet. They thought they still had control. They thought they were directing the play. And that was exactly how I wanted it. The paramedics arrived quickly, weaving through the crowd with their bags swinging at their sides. The music had cut off, the lights felt harsher, and the whispers swelled into a storm. Clarissa groaned as they eased her into a chair, her skin paling under the chandeliers. My parents clung to their act. Grady murmuring reassurances, Noella's face twisted in frantic devotion, but their eyes kept darting toward me, sharp, searching, calculating. And I stayed calm. I adjusted my glass on the table, folded my hands in my lap, and let the chaos orbit around me. Because I knew the truth, and truth is patient. Sometimes I wonder if you felt that moment yourself, the one where you hold the evidence in your hands, and yet you wait. You wait not out of fear, but out of strategy. If you've ever had to hold back the truth until the right moment, share it below. Because timing isn't just survival, it's power. Across the ballroom, the technician at the AV booth looked uneasy, his headset crackling as he awaited the next cue. Guests shifted restless and suspicious, their gazes flicking between my parents and me. And for the first time, I felt the current of the night changing. The sympathy wasn't flowing toward Clarissa's collapse anymore. It was drifting away like smoke through an open window. My father's jaw locked tight, his eyes narrowing as though he could will me into silence. My mother's hand shook as she clutched Clarissa's wrist, her smile frozen, her words too sharp to be genuine. They didn't realize it yet, but the performance was over. I leaned back in my chair, the clutch heavy against my hip, Hollis's phone warm in their hand beside me. The truth was already captured. The only question left was when to unleash it. And as the paramedics wheeled Clarissa toward the exit, I realized something profound. Survival wasn't the end goal anymore. Exposure was. I wasn't here just to live through the night. I was here to end the Ross family's story, once and for all. The ballroom had been a stage for so long, but now it had transformed into a theater of unease. The chandeliers still sparkled, the champagne still bubbled in untouched glasses, but the mood had cracked. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering beneath the swell of confusion, their eyes darting between my parents and me. Clarissa's collapse had shifted the tone from glittering celebration to something jagged, unsettled. I rose slowly, every movement deliberate, and threaded my way through the chaos. Paramedics knelt by Clarissa, checking vitals, their voices brisk and professional. My parents hovered, close hands, fluttering faces carved into masks of parental devotion. To the guests, they were desperate, protective parents. To me, they were actors clinging to a role they were about to lose. I caught my father's gaze for half a second. His smile was gone, now replaced by something colder, something feral. My mother's eyes flicked to me, sharp with accusation, as if daring me to speak, but I didn't flinch, because the power wasn't in reacting. It was in waiting until their house of cards collapsed in front of everyone. And the collapse had already begun. Guests who once orbited them with flattery were now pulling back their polite neutrality, curdling into suspicion. Phones were out, recording, capturing fragments of whispers, Clarissa's pale face, my parents' darting eyes. The social tide had shifted, and they didn't even realize it yet. I stood at the edge of the crowd, letting the scene play out. Hollis moved closer, their phone angled discreetly, capturing it all. "It's all here," they whispered. "Every second, every angle. They can't spin this one." I nodded, my throat dry, but my mind sharp. That was what tonight had been about all along, wasn't it, spin? For years, they'd twisted the narrative until I was the ungrateful child, the unstable one, the leech. They'd rewritten my victories into Clarissa's triumphs, recast my independence as reliance. But spin only works in the shadows. And tonight, everything was unraveling under the spotlight. As the paramedics lifted Clarissa onto a stretcher, murmurs swelled louder. "Did you see her collapse?" She looked fine one minute. Strange, wasn't it? The suspicion spread like wildfire, catching on every whispered word. My parents pressed tighter into their performance, but the cracks were showing. And here's the thing I want you to hear sometimes. You don't need to strike. Sometimes the truth will crack the facade all by itself. Have you ever watched someone's mask slip slowly, inevitably, until they couldn't hold it up anymore? Drop it in the comments, because those moments matter. They remind us that even the best liars run out of stage eventually. I turned my eyes toward the AV booth tucked into the far corner of the ballroom. The technician stood nervously, headset clutched in his hand, eyes flicking between his screens and the growing commotion. I slipped a USB drive from my clutch and approached. My voice was low, steady, carrying no room for negotiation. "Play this." His eyes widened, but he nodded. In that moment, I wasn't the girl in the shadows anymore. I was commanding the stage. As I stepped back into the crowd, the massive screen above the stage flickered. The slideshow of curated family memories vanished mid-frame. Guests lifted their heads, attention snapping to the shifting images. And then it began. Grainy footage filled the screen, my father leaning over my place, setting the flick of his fingers, the powder slipping into my champagne, the fizz. The camera angle was low but clear. Then the swap. My glass for Clarissa's. And finally, the collapse. Gasps shattered the room. "My God," someone whispered. Another voice sharper. "That's attempted poisoning." Every eye swung to my parents. In that instant, the collapse was complete. The ballroom went silent before the storm. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector and the shifting of silk dresses as guests leaned forward, eyes glued to the massive screen. On it, the truth played out in damning clarity, my father's hand hovering above my glass, the flick of his fingers, the powder slipping in the fizz, the subtle swap. Then Clarissa, lifting the glass, laughing, sipping. Gasps tore through the crowd. One woman near the front covered her mouth. Another man muttered loud enough for others to hear, "That's attempted poisoning." My parents stood frozen in the spotlight, their perfect facade crumbling. Grady's face went pale, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles jumped. Noella's smile trembled, stretched too wide her eyes, darting around the room, desperate for an escape. But there was no spin left, no saving act. The truth was in the air, unshakable, undeniable. And then from the edge of the crowd, Aunt Renata stepped forward. Her voice cut through the murmurs, calm but resonant. "I have additional documents," she said, holding the envelope high under the stage lights, proving that Danielle paid her own way through college with scholarships, grants, and work. These two have lied for years. The crowd stirred whispers, becoming sharp, accusatory. People shifted back from my parents as though the very air around them was contaminated. Allies who had smiled at them minutes ago now looked away, embarrassed to have ever stood so close. Renata spread the papers across a nearby table, the crisp pages catching the light. Bank records, grant letters, official seals. Guests pressed in to see their phones capturing every word, every document. The tide had fully turned. I stepped forward, then my heels echoing in the stunned hush. My voice carried steady, clear. "My whole life I've been told to stay quiet. Tonight you saw why. Silence is how they win." The words hung in the air like iron. And for the first time I wasn't invisible. For the first time the room saw me not as the leech, not as the afterthought, but as the truth they couldn't deny. Two uniformed officers already present for security began to move. Their hands rested near their belts, their eyes locked on my parents. The whispers rose into shouts, "Arrest them. They tried to kill her." We all saw it. My mother's composure shattered. "This is a mistake," she hissed, her voice too sharp, too desperate. "It's not what it looks like." But her words fell flat against the weight of evidence, against the projection replaying her husband's hand, slipping poison into his own daughter's drink. Grady's jaw was stone, his silence damning. He knew there was no explanation that could save him now. And here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever watched the truth finally break through years of lies like sunlight through stained glass? If you have, tell me about that moment in the comments. Because the truth, when it comes, is unstoppable, and it always comes. As the officers reached the head table, the entire room shifted again. It wasn't just whispers now. It was outrage. Phones lifted higher, capturing every second. Guests who had once toasted my parents' wealth and power now muttered words like criminal, coward monsters. I stood taller, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. They had tried to erase me, to silence me, to remove me altogether. But here I was, and here was the truth, blazing across a 20-foot screen. My parents had always believed appearances could shield them, that wealth and status could smother any scandal. But appearances are fragile things, and tonight they shattered like glass under a hammer. The ballroom was no longer theirs, the stage was no longer theirs, it was mine, and I wasn't about to give it back. The moment the video ended, the air inside the ballroom turned electric. You could almost hear the shift, like the low rumble before a storm breaks. My parents stood cornered, the lies they'd polished for decades cracking under the weight of raw, undeniable truth. And then came the sound that finished the job, not gasps, not whispers, but footsteps. Officers in uniform moved with purpose through the sea of guests, their badges catching the light. Their presence alone sent ripples through the crowd. Grady stiffened his face, carved into stone. He'd built his entire career on authority, on the illusion of being untouchable. Now, the very symbols of law and order were coming for him. His silence was deafening. My mother, though, tried to salvage it. Her voice rose high, thin with desperation. "It's not what it looks like. You don't understand. This is all a mistake." But no one was listening. The audience wasn't on their side anymore. Phones were raised in nearly every hand, recording, live streaming, broadcasting their downfall in real time. Guests edged away from them, no longer willing to stand too close, no longer dazzled by their wealth or reputation. I stepped forward, then not rushing, but steady. My heels echoed with every step until I reached the head table. I placed a small bundle on the linen cloth, the Ross family crest pendant, the keys to the house, and an envelope. My voice was even every word deliberate. "These belong to you. I'm taking back my name, my time, and my life." The silence that followed was heavy, reverent. Then from somewhere in the crowd a voice broke through, good for her. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it spread like a spark. Guests nodded, murmurs turned to affirmations. And for the first time in my life, the current of a room was not against me, it was with me. Renata stood nearby, her expression calm but fierce, like she had been waiting years to see this moment. She placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, no words needed. The gesture alone said everything. "You're not alone anymore." The officers closed in, one of them pulling out handcuffs. My mother's mask slipped entirely, now her face twisting, her voice sharp with panic. "Danielle, stop this. We are your parents. We gave you everything." "No," I said simply. "You took everything." And with that, the illusion shattered completely. Now I want to pause here, because I know some of you have felt this too, the exact moment when the crowd turns, when the power dynamic flips, when years of being silenced are finally broken by truth too loud to ignore. If you've ever had a moment when your silence ended and your voice changed everything, share it below. Your story might be the light someone else needs to speak. Around me, the ballroom buzzed with a new energy. Guests whispered words like "finally" and "justice." The officers guided my parents toward the exit, their hands behind their backs, faces drained of all pretense. Clarissa, pale and groaning on the stretcher, could only watch her role as the family's golden child collapsing in on itself. And me, I stood taller, not just because they were being taken away, but because for once I wasn't playing defense. I was claiming space, claiming truth, claiming my freedom in front of the very audience that had once been trained to look past me. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years they had shoved me to the margins, behind pillars near kitchens, out of sight. But tonight, when the truth came crashing down, I was center stage, and I wasn't stepping off. The ballroom still buzzed with the aftermath of the reveal, a mix of outrage, disbelief, and a strange sort of awe. The image of my father's hand over my champagne glass had seared itself into everyone's mind. But the night wasn't over. For me, it was only just beginning. I moved closer to the head table, the center of everything they had once controlled. The crest pendant glinted under the lights where I had set it down. The keys to the house lay beside it, a hollow symbol of belonging that never truly belonged to me. And finally, the envelope, my signature scrawled across, legal withdrawal papers from every shared asset, every tie that bound me to them. I looked at the symbols of a life I no longer wanted, and then at the faces turned toward me waiting. And I spoke. My whole life I was told to keep quiet, to smile when they called me a leech, to laugh when they erased my name, to sit down when they shoved me to the shadows. But tonight, you've all seen why. Silence is how they win. The hush that followed was powerful. Dozens of eyes locked on me, hundreds of breaths held. I let the words settle before continuing. I'm done being silent. I'm done letting them use me, erase me, rewrite me. I am not their shadow. I am not their scapegoat. I am their reckoning. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a shout, but it didn't need to be. The room leaned into my words like they were oxygen. From behind me, one of the officers shifted his hand firm on my father's arm. Grady's jaw stayed clenched, his face carved into stone. My mother, though, couldn't hold back anymore. Her voice cracked, desperate and shrill. "Danielle, think about what you're doing. We are your family. We made you who you are." I turned to her, calm, unshaken. "You didn't make me. You tried to break me, and the only thing you gave me was the strength to walk away." I picked up the keys, the crest, the envelope, and placed them firmly into her hands. These belong to you, all of it. Keep the house, keep the name, keep the lies. I don't want them. I want my freedom. The room erupted, not with applause, not with cheers, but with something deeper murmurs of agreement, nods of respect, whispers of good for her. The tide of social power had shifted fully, and it swept my parents away with it. And here's what I want to tell you. Watching this now, sometimes freedom isn't about what you gain. Sometimes it's about what you finally set down. Have you ever cut ties so sharp, so final, that you felt lighter the moment you did it? If so, share it below. Because freedom isn't just walking away, it's refusing to carry what was never yours to bear. Renata stepped forward, her smile faint but resolute. For years she had been the quiet witness, the lone relative who saw the truth, but had been powerless to stop it. Now her presence was confirmation, validation. She leaned close, whispered, where only I could hear, "You did it. They can't touch you anymore. You." I looked around the ballroom one last time, the chandeliers, the tables, the stunned faces. This was the stage they had always owned, the spotlight they had always claimed. And now, in the moment of their downfall, it was mine. I took a step back, my shoulders squared, my head high, my voice steady and final. I'm not walking away empty-handed. I'm walking away with my name, my truth, and my life. And that's worth more than anything they could have given me. And with that, I turned from the head table, leaving the symbols of their empire behind. For the first time, I wasn't leaving in silence. I was leaving with power. The aftermath of the revelation was immediate and merciless. The ballroom that had once glittered with champagne and laughter now felt like a courtroom. My parents, once the masters of every detail, were reduced to actors caught mid-scene, their poise shattered, their smiles brittle. The officers had moved in, guiding them toward the exit with practiced precision, and yet the social weight of what had just happened pressed heavier than any legal handcuffs. Every guest in that room had witnessed the truth, the flick of the powder into my glass, the switch, the collapse. I stepped away from the chaos, letting my gaze sweep over the crowd. Guests murmured in disbelief, many holding phones high, capturing every second. Conversations paused mid-word, people exchanging glances that spoke volumes. The world had shifted in the span of a heartbeat. My parents were no longer untouchable, no longer immune to judgment. The aura of control they had cultivated for decades evaporated like mist under the morning sun. In that moment, I realized the depth of what I had accomplished. This wasn't just survival, this was exposure. This was reclaiming my narrative in front of everyone who had once cheered for the illusion and overlooked the truth. And for the first time, I felt the weight of my own name unburdened, free from the shadows they had tried to cast over it. I moved through the ballroom with quiet confidence, acknowledging the stares without needing approval. Hollis followed camera, still recording, ensuring that nothing would be rewritten or denied later. I reached the AV booth, where the technician looked at me, eyes wide, waiting for the next cue. I placed my hand on the USB drive, the device that had become the catalyst for this revelation. Behind me, my parents' expressions were a study in defeat. Grady's jaw was taut, his eyes hollow. Noella's face, usually composed and polished, now betrayed panic, anger, and disbelief all at once. They had tried to control the narrative for years, but the evidence was undeniable. Nothing could rewrite it now. I turned my attention to the guests. Many were still processing what they had just seen, some whispering, others openly expressing shock and disbelief. Aunt Renata stepped forward, holding documents high for all to see, copies of scholarship awards, grant letters, and receipts that proved my independent achievements. The weight of proof, combined with the visual evidence from Hollis's recording, created a force that no social skill, charm, or wealth could resist. I felt a shift in the energy around me. The people who had once orbited my parents with deference were now questioning them, distancing themselves, and considering their own perception of what had been true. The power balance had been overturned, and while I had been careful to maintain my composure, I could finally breathe, knowing that the narrative that had long oppressed me was collapsing before my eyes. Then I did something decisive. I stepped toward the head table and placed a small bundle down the Ross family crest pendant, the keys to the house, and an envelope containing my signed withdrawal from every shared asset. My voice was steady, unflinching, as I addressed them, but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "These belong to you," I said. "I am taking back my name, my time, and my life." The room reacted in waves. A few murmured in approval, others looked at me in awe, and the officers continued their work moving my parents toward accountability. For the first time in decades, the power dynamic that had always favored them was fully reversed, and I was standing at the center, no longer hidden, no longer silenced. Freedom, I realized, wasn't about fleeing. It wasn't about hiding in the shadows or enduring their manipulation quietly. Freedom was about stepping into the light with truth as your shield. Tonight, I had not only survived, but reclaimed everything that had ever been denied to me. And as I turned, the ballroom behind me seemed smaller. Its sparkle dimmed the illusions, dissipating. I was walking away from them, but I was walking toward something far greater: ownership of my life, my choices, and my future. I stepped out of the ballroom into the crisp night air, the city lights of Seattle glimmering across Puget Sound like a promise of new beginnings. For the first time in my life, I felt truly unbound. The chaos, the humiliation, the stolen credit, it was all behind me. The burden of being a leech, the shadow cast over my achievements, the quiet torment I had endured for decades, they could no longer touch me. The ferry I had planned to take was waiting, a quiet vessel, cutting through the dark waters, ferrying me away from the gilded cage of my family. I leaned against the rail, letting the cold wind whip through my hair. The skyline blurred in the distance, and in that blur, I could see myself clearly for the first time, shoulders squared, head high, every inch of me alive and mine. This was more than escape. This was reclamation. All the years of erasure, all the stolen moments of recognition, all the whispers of doubt, they had built the strength I now carried. And in that strength there was freedom. Not just from them, but for me, for my choices, for my own life. Even as the city lights faded behind me, I could feel the ripple of what had occurred. The video had already circulated far beyond the ballroom. Local news anchors repeated my name with the same gravity they had once reserved for my parents. Within days, legal charges were filed: attempted poisoning, conspiracy, and fraud. My parents' social circle disintegrated almost overnight. Business partners withdrew, charity sponsors, vanished, invitations that once lined their calendar dried up. The very network they had used to maintain power turned away from them, leaving only the truth in its place. And I was left with what I had always truly wanted: independence. A small apartment near the university district became my sanctuary. Not large, not glamorous, but mine, paid for with my work, my intellect, my effort. Projects at an environmental engineering firm allowed me to build real, tangible achievements, ones that needed no family crest, no borrowed prestige. A month later, I sat across a polished table at a final settlement meeting. I slid a document across to my parents, a full relinquishment of any claim to the family estate, coupled with a legal ban on using my name, my achievements, or my identity for their gain. My voice was firm as I said, "This is the last time you will profit from my existence." They opened their mouths to argue, but I was already on my feet, leaving behind everything that had once been used to control me. The city, the water, the night, it was all before me, vast and unclaimed. The skyline blurred into the horizon, and I felt for the first time the profound weight of liberation. Justice, I realized, isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with applause or fanfare. Sometimes it's the quiet act of reclaiming your life, the decisive step of walking away from those who would chain you. Sometimes it's the sound of a door closing behind you for the last time. As the ferry cut through the waters, I reflected on what I had learned. Strength is not in compliance, it's in knowing your value. Freedom is not given, it's taken through courage, patience, and unwavering self-belief. And though the world can be cruel, it will bend under the weight of truth if you have the courage to wield it. And now I want to hear from you. Wherever you're watching from, whether it's the quiet of your morning coffee or the stillness of late night, have you ever had to walk away to save yourself? Share your story below. Because if my journey tells you anything, it's this: strength isn't silence, power isn't granted. Freedom is claimed one deliberate step at a time. As the ferry carried me forward, the horizon opening endlessly ahead, I finally smiled, not the imposed, careful smile from years past, but a real, unshakable one. This was mine. All of it, my name, my time, my life. The next morning, the city woke to a story that had already traveled farther than I could have imagined. Local news anchors recounted the events of the night, with the gravity they once reserved for my parents. Clarissa recovered physically, but the carefully curated image of innocence and brilliance she had worn for years crumbled as everyone saw the truth. My work had been stolen, my achievements erased, and yet I had endured, observed, and reclaimed what was mine. I moved into my small apartment near the university district, a place that didn't gleam with wealth but resonated with the hum of independence. Every item was mine, every wall my own, every morning a reminder that freedom could be simple, tangible, and wholly authentic. I began consulting for an environmental engineering firm, leading projects that mattered ones built entirely on merit, vision, and dedication, not family connections or stolen credit. A month later, at the final legal settlement, I handed over a signed document to my parents, a full relinquishment of any claim to my life, my assets, or my identity. There would be no further manipulation, no more attempts to twist my achievements, and no opportunity for them to profit from my name. In that simple act, I felt the weight of decades lift, replaced by clarity and resolve. Walking along the waterfront that evening, the skyline of Seattle blurred into the horizon, softened by twilight. I paused, taking a deep breath of the crisp, salty air. For the first time, I recognized the woman reflected in the glass of the ferry terminal, not the silenced, invisible girl from the ballroom, but someone unshakable, strong, and whole. This wasn't just survival. It was a declaration of self, a reclamation of dignity and autonomy. I realized that justice doesn't always arrive in the form of noise or spectacle. Often it comes quietly in the decisive choices we make, in the boundaries we set, and in the courage to walk away from those who would seek to diminish us. That clarity, that ownership of our lives is a freedom no one can take away. And as I leaned against the rail, watching the city lights dance across the water, I knew that the future was mine to shape, unburdened by the shadows of those who had tried to control me. Every step forward, every decision, every breath was a testament to the strength found not in silence but in truth, perseverance, and the unwavering resolve to claim one's own life. The doors of the past had closed and a new chapter began, one written entirely by me.